Welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, Coach Brad, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com. Today is Friday, which means it's very philosophical. I'm joined by my co-host, Duncan Palamourdas. Duncan, how are we doing, my friend?
Good. How's everything with you, Brad? People, I'm sure they want to know how the movie was.
The movie's good. The movie's good. Love and Thunder. Great one. Top Gun's great. Where the Crawdads Sing is great. Maybe I'm very easy to please when it comes to movies, but that's okay. I can live with actually enjoying most movies that I see. It seems sad to not enjoy the majority of the movies you go and see, personally.
I agree with you 100%. And my wife and I yesterday we watched Elvis. I highly recommend it. By the way, it was well made and closely, fairly accurate, as accurate these movies can be. Like it was closely to fact checked. So if people are interested,
so did you fact check it before or after the movie?
Always after.
In the movie before fact checking it. No.
Always after.
Yeah, I think we're going to see Elvis. We were going to go see it, but it was pretty long, so we opted for a shorter movie, and I think we're going to watch it when it comes out on demand. But definitely excited to see Elvis as well. What do we have outside of the summer movies? What do we have to talk about today on Philosophical Friday?
Today we're thinking of changing up a little bit and go semi-philosophical, semi-strategical, and talk about the idea of the elusive initiative. So for some of you who may not know, initiative, which we will define, is sort of like that idea of being the first aggressor, or actually technically the last aggressor, the person who decided what the price is going to be on different streets. And it's a concept that it brings a lot of controversy. Like, is initiative a thing? Is it necessary? What is it? How can people use it in some ways to profit and stuff like that? We're going to try to explore everything initiative today. And
all right. I'm excited because I think we disagree in some spots over initiative. So always good to disagree with you.
Absolutely. Always good to disagree with you. I love that line. That's true. It's interesting. Like the important thing is it's all about understanding. Disagreements are interesting I agree with you 100% for a reason, because it's not so much the outcome of the conversation that matters. What matters is what is the thought process behind certain ideas. That's what fascinates me. I find it interesting. What is it that some people find useful about initiative, and what is it that people find useless about initiative? And I think, like, no matter what the audience's opinion is on the subject, I think is very useful to know pros and cons. So basically, taking the one side of the argument versus the other side of the argument can be beneficial for people who can be on either side.
And for very selfish reasons, I'm happy to disagree with people that I respect, because it's an opportunity for me to learn and a potential opportunity for me to grow. And I love those kind of opportunities that can shift my paradigm on a specific thing. And they happen when you disagree about said topic. That's where the opportunity lies. So
likewise,
going to start going to our good friend, Merriam-Webster, who's just always been a dear.
Yeah.
Initiative, the way that they define initiative is the power or opportunity to act or take charge before others do. So that's the technical definition of initiative there. And we can now, I guess, explore from there initiative in the poker sense. So first, I'll ask you what your definition of initiative is in poker.
Correct. And I'm saying correct also to what the definition you just gave, because there is a notion of firstness, but because poker's first is last, we have to be a little bit careful here. So what do I mean by that? Poker is a very weird game, right? So you are first if you actually last in some sense, right? I mean, you need to have like sometimes it's equivalent of having the last laugh. You have the advantage if you are last. So I often say that, for example, chess is a game of again, when you're thinking about it's a race game, who gets to kill the opposite or capture the opposite king first. So that means that, you know, whoever plays first has the advantage. A poker, this is a little bit reverse, because you want to be the one who has the most information and act last. So this is a very long-winded way, and I apologize, for basically saying that you want to be the first one to grab the power, but in poker that means to be the last aggressor. So what that actually means is that you are the first person to determine what the price is going to be for the pot, right? Whether, let's say we're talking about pre-flop, and let's say just hypothetically that we are, let's say let's say on the big blind, the cutoff opens to 3x, and then we're on the big blind and we make it a 10x. That is maybe, let's say 11x. That is a and then let's say the cutoff calls. So we have determined that the price for the pre-flop pot is going to be 11 big blinds. So even though technically we sort of like, we're the last person to make a bidding, we are, first of all, we are technically the first person who made the bidding at 11, if that makes sense. So we're first and last at the same time. But altogether, just to summarize this very long-winded way, we want to be the last aggressor, right? The first to determine the price, but the last aggressor.
I'm very confused, Duncan. I'm gonna I'm gonna be honest.
Yes.
I got lost. I got lost in that.
Let me, okay, I apologize. That's actually on me. Let me try one more time. You want to be the first person to make the largest bet, if that makes sense. For me, that's initiative. So you want to be the first person to make the largest bet. And in that example, the largest bet was 11x. And the big blind was the first person to make the largest bet. It wasn't the first raise or anything like that. It was technically the last raise, but it was the first biggest bet, right?
So, okay, I see what you're saying. And I guess my question is, like, as it relates to initiative, I mean, the in-position player does have the option of placing the last biggest bet.
Correct.
As well, right?
Correct. So, and he refuses that. They refuse that in that hypothetical, right? So this is very relevant, right? I mean, that's what makes it the initiative. So the way I like to talk in pictures. So let's say that Bobby is in the cutoff. So Bobby says, "I think I have the best hand, and therefore I raise to 3x." And then Ali says, "No, you don't have the best hand. I do, and I'm going to raise to 11x." And then Bobby says, "You know what? I'm not sure. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I'm not sure. I'm going to find out. I'm just going to call." Sure. But like as story goes, Alex has the stronger story, basically, because she's the one who she's the last person to flinch in this joust.
So going to the flop and projecting forward. I mean, I guess so. If that's how you're defining initiative, tell me about the utility of it post flop.
Okay. So the utility post flop is twofold. One is strategical and the other is psychological. So the strategical aspect of it is, first of all, is the fact that because, again, Bobby did not 4-bet before the flop, the chances of him having, the top premium is at least discounted. Right. So the chances of him having, the aces, the kings, although, yeah, I mean, sometimes people, again, and we know solvers suggest that, and we all know that people will flat with those hands sometimes, but at least the top of his range has been discounted. In other words, Bobby has a capped range, or at least semi-capped range, and Alex has a purely uncapped range. That's the strategical aspect of it. The psychological aspect of it, which is sometimes ties to the fact that she has a semi-uncapped range, is that people will tend to overestimate how strong she is, especially if she combines that initiative with other aspects, like, playing a tight range and also having position, which is, in this case is not true. She doesn't have position. But if she combined with those two aspects, people tend to do things like, I'm checking to the razor. That's a psychological aspect. Or people are doing things like, you know what? She bet the flop. I don't have much of an equity. I don't want to stick around and find out. again, that's a psychological aspect. She did raise before the flop. So there is a certain psychological aspect to it. But the strategical aspect, which is very real, is the fact that she keeps her range uncapped, which means she can actually represent more hands than actually Bobby could. So in other words, Bobby, in that sense, he's going to have to take a defensive role and hope that Alex does not have the strongest of the hands that she represents and be correct in his guessing game. That's what I like to call Bobby has to play the guessing game.
So, okay. So I see what you're saying. And to be fair, I don't even know that if we stated our exact opinions. My opinion of initiative is that it's manufactured, and sort of a mirage these days. And yours is that it's not a mirage, right? And so, yeah, interestingly, I just get to poke holes in your thing, which is much easier than your side of it.
No, please.
So the first is like the psychological element of it, where that's okay. Like I get the psychological side of it and the fact that like people feel it, but just because people feel it, does that necessarily mean that it's true? And we also have oversimplifications where we didn't discuss the flop texture or the board type,
right?
Where they're very specific boards because of Alex's uncapped range, like a 6-7-8 board, for instance, is going to hit the in position preflop caller more than the out of position preflop raiser. They're going to have more sets, more straights, more two pair, right? Where Alex, even though she had initiative and had an uncapped range preflop, when paired with the information gain on the flop, now she doesn't necessarily have the range advantage, which means, you know, her initiative, in my opinion, isn't actually a real thing, because now, even though she did make the last bet, she still doesn't get to bet here.
Absolutely. And actually, funny enough, I would agree 100% with you. And I would say that probably I would agree with you. I would not necessarily agree with the conclusion that the initiative is a mirage, but I would say that in certain situations, initiative is not helpful. So the way I like to see of it is like you're looking at a company's balance sheet, right? And then you look at like income, you look at debt, you look at, you know, the price of the stock, if you're interested in, like, let's say how cheap or how expensive the stock is at the moment. And I would say that initiative is just one of those factors. You just named a factor which is far more relevant in this specific situation than initiative. And I would agree with you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the range decomposition. So I would say that in certain situations, initiative is not necessarily a mirage, but not as impactful. It only accounts for like 2% of the hand, as opposed to...
Yes, then give me a situation where initiative is very impactful to the hand, and yet, but it's also not a function of the person with initiative just having substantially more stronger hands than the other opponent.
Yeah. So like the classic example that I like to give is the free card. So initiative, what it does is, like, you know, a lot of people, for example, let's say you have like pocket deuces on the button and there are a bunch of limpers, and a lot of people, again, let's say Alex sits on the button, there's a lot of limping, and a lot of people with, let's say that we play just for the sake of, we have to give background information, otherwise everything's going to sound out there. Let's say we're playing somewhat deep, you know, 100 to 150 blinds deep, sometimes even more, especially if you play cash games. And a lot of people are inclined to say, you know what, I have the button, I'm going to call with the deuces. You know, deuces is a hand that, you know, if we play 5 or 6 ways, I want to, you know, I'm going to realize. And I agree with anybody who says that, you know, like by limping there, they're going to realize. My argument is, if you raise there with deuces on the button, you're going to realize again, but you're going to get a bigger percentage of a bigger pie, I would argue. So my argument goes something like this. You raise. Now, assuming that, you know, you're playing against passive opponents who, for the most part, they're going to either limp call or limp fold, every outcome is great. If they limp fold, now you have extra dead money. If they limp call, now here's what happens. Let's say that everybody limp calls, right? And however many blinds they decided to call before or check before, they're still calling. So we're on the button. We raise to, let's say, hypothetically, right? Let's say we have, let's be specific. We have 3 limpers. So we raise to, let's say, 6, 7x. I mean, if it's live, maybe 8x, something like that. And then we pick up 4 callers, the big blind and the 3 limpers, right? So right now, we have about like 40x if we remove like let's say the rake, or if it's timed, it doesn't matter. But let's say around 40x in the middle, and we have pocket deuces, and most likely we're going to miss the flop. But what's going to happen on a limped pot? More often than not, if we're playing against loose passive opponents, more often than not, people are going to check to us, even if they flop something big. And I've seen that happening again and again and again in live settings. People, like they will flop top pair, two pair, they will flop sets. They're not leading out, even on scary boards, because they're thinking, oh, the initiator, Duncan is sitting there. Oh, this guy is aggressive. He's going to bet. But what are we going to do when we miss with deuces? We can check back, and now we get to see 4 cards instead of 3. On top of that, if we get like a really great board, like let's say King 7-7, or we get like the classic, King 7-3 or something like that, we can still see bet. And after, if we don't take it down, let's say, then we get to see 2 more cards. We get to see the turn and the river. So this is a classic example where the fact that we raised before the flop allows us to actually get extra cards. Now, yes.
Yes. Let's go with the whole poking exercise. Yes. There is an outcome that is really bad, and that's if the blinds 3-bet you and you don't get to realize any equity because you get 3-bet from the big blind. You 6x, they make it 30, and now everybody folds and you have to fold because you can't realize your equity.
Right. That's correct. But I would argue that, again, this is a small price to pay for the potential of stacking 1 or 2 people in that situation, right? Which is not going to be as easy if we actually play a limped pot, because in a limped pot we're not going to get anybody, we're not going to get all the money. Plus, we're getting the opportunity to actually utilize all the super dry boards, which will happen about 20% of the time. So we get like a situation where 20% of the time we can take it down with a c-bet, and then the remaining, let's say 80% of the time, we get at least 4 cards, if not 5, to actually make a set. So I agree. I see that disadvantage, right? But like again, it depends on the games that we're playing, right? I mean, if we're playing against people who will squeeze a lot from the blinds, and I can see that 100%. I'm not just saying that. As a matter of fact, I would argue this is the correct play to play against the initiative. The best way to play against the initiative is trying to get the initiative on your own, which is why games like at a higher level get raise, re-raise, 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 re-raise. I know that you know, I know that you know that you know that you know, and then eventually, the person who is the most aggressive. I
would also argue like there's 4 limpers, right? Or 3 limpers.
Sure.
You limp behind, small blind completes, big blind checks. There's 6 bigs in the pot. If the flop's like King 6 deuce, and by the way, like, so on the dry boards, it's not as if we get to just win, right? Like they are going to have top pair. They're not, they're not going to fold. And plus, when you're trying to like c-bet into like 2 or 3 players as like a unit, they need to overfold exponentially more than if it's versus 1 player. So a lot of times you're not just investing that 1 flop bet. You're investing probably a river bet as well, and playing, a much bigger pot with a much weaker hand. And because of that dynamic that you mentioned before of like people check to the pre-flop raiser, when you raise, they check to you. But when you limp, someone could bet with like top pair when you flop a set, and then you get to put in 2 bets on the flop. And then you still have the option to stack said villain in a limp pot at 100 big blinds deep.
Right. 3 things I want to say here. Number 1, let's start from the end. On a limp pot is a little bit harder to get the money in because people get to be more suspicious when you put a lot of money when there's little in the middle, right? So I've seen that again and again. Like, somebody will lead out, you make that raise, and then the person is kind of sort of like wisen up, right? It says, well, I have to pair. That's not much money in the middle. You know what? You really want my...
Come on. You're saying that people are going to limp flop top pair and then fold to a flop raise in passive players live.
Yes. On limp pots. Not always, but it's not going to be as frequent as when the money... Like, the thing is that like people have given me more action with weaker hands when there's more money in the middle, because they just don't want to give up. But sometimes was like they have that thing of like,
well, that's like sunk cost fallacy basically is what generally comes into play there.
I agree with you that it's a fallacy, right? But I mean, and I agree with you that I could even have the wrong read in some situations. I'm just telling you, like, anecdotally what happens. And again, one thing that I wanted to say earlier, it matters what the rest of your strategy is, right? Initiative doesn't work the same for everybody. Like if you don't have like an ultra aggressive strategy, for instance. But there's two more things I want to say for the other thing that you said earlier. And I forgot what it was, but I'll come back to this. No. Make your comment, and then I'll get back to that. I'll remember.
What's interesting is, like, when people do take initiative, is that while they are able to steal equity from villains, they also open the door to under-realizing equity themselves, rather than in position like checking behind, for instance. In this case, when initiative is seized on the button, there's the opportunity for the blinds to 3-bet big, and then we fold. Whereas if you limp and the blinds raise to like 7 bigs and 3 people call, then you have a prime situation to call on the button, and you get to realize equity. So by opening the action, you open the door to under-realizing versus over-realizing.
Absolutely. And for the listener, this is an excellent point that Brad is making, right? I just want to make it, and I'm going to sound completely a hypocrite, but I just remember a hand from like, I think 10 years ago over at the bicycle casino. I had pocket threes. There was a guy who was raising every hand on the big blind. It doesn't matter what he had. And for the first time in I don't know how many years, I decided to limp with my pocket threes, button limps. And then sure enough, the guy from the big blind makes it a very big raise. I call the raise, button calls. And to make a long story short, the button had ace king, the flop come something like king 7-3. I stuck the button, not the big blind who was raising every hand. And I agree with Brad 100%. You reminded me of this, right? I mean, it's an excellent point. This is, again, we have a risk reward situation to consider, and sometimes avoiding these situations is very important. So you have to ask yourself, what is more likely to happen? Is it more likely to happen for me to lose that equity that I have with pocket deuces by being 3-bet on the big blind, or all the other benefits? Which, by the way, I remember what were the other 2 benefits. So let's say that we don't get 3-bet from the big blind, but instead somebody flops top pair, and they get to flop top pair on a board which is maybe queen high dry or king high dry or something like that, and we decide to c-bet. I would argue that out of all the hands they can have, when they have a hand and they don't fold, we want them to have top pair. Because why do we want them to have top pair? We bet and they end up having something. If they are to have something, we want them to have top pair, because then we're going to check the turn and see the river, and hopefully we hit a set by then, and then we're going to bet really, 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 really big and try to get value that way. So that's one side benefit of the initiative. So when we want to take the pot down, but in the off chance that it fails, the range is actually much stronger, which means that if we actually hit the set, which now we're going to get a turn and a river, which is not much. I mean, 10% is not much, but it's something. And it's not just the 10%. It's also that if we actually hit a set on the turn or river, it's going to be so disguised, there's no way in hell they're folding, especially if we check the turn back. So we're gonna win a very big pot. That's number one. And number two, if they get a top pair on like a queen high or a jack high dry, then we get an opportunity to bluff overcards, which is, again, a thing that you have to know who you're playing against, right? I mean, it matters. I'm not usually advocating, like bluffing recreational players, but if like the board, again, because we have the initiative and because they could think, oh, you had ace king all along, right? You had ace king all along, and then, we're not in agreement.
Well, but okay. So, all right. So my first counter here, it sounds as if this strategic decision that you're advocating for is based anecdotally, correct? Yeah. I mean, if you haven't been limping, if you never limp, then we don't really get to see that side of the coin or the benefits of it through any sort of like data, which data is hard to come by anyway, playing live poker.
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, I have about close to 2 million hands online. It's not like I've never played online, but one thing, I didn't limp online either, but the one thing I have, which is a proxy for my, proxy for limping, is when I check my big blind option. So I've seen a lot of times that when I try to get value, because again, on the big blind, when I hit anything on the big blind, two pair plus, I bet like a maniac, and I mean, I lead out like a maniac, right? Because again, I try to get as much value as possible. And I've seen that usually I don't get action. And it's the reason for that, again,
well, it could be a function that because the villain limp themselves, they tend to not have very strong hands. And I assume you're playing heads up because that tends to be your format of choice, right?
Correct. I mean, online I used to play heads up.
I have like a nuclear weapon in my back pocket.
Please.
That, like, what if I just have data that says that when you limp with small pocket pairs in position, when you over limp, it just makes more money than when you raise over a very large sample size.
I would believe you. I don't have a reason not to believe you. The question is, if I limp with a small pocket pair, would I make more money? Because it depends who actually is in control of the hand, right? That's something, because I have tried it personally. I've tried these different strategies. Yeah. And it really does depend what is the rest of your strategy. Because one of the things that, for example, Alex, the heroine of my book, does, she is fairly tight and fairly aggressive. So she's utilizing these very rare occasions where she's going to be involved in a hand by like basically blasting off, essentially, right? So if we're talking about someone who could be playing more hands and they're going to be involved in more hands, I could see a strategy in which the initiative doesn't play as much of a role, right? Because you get to be in as many pots as possible to realize, as many hands as possible. But what if your strategy revolves around the concept of go big or go home? You either everyone at the table is, looking at you, what you're going to do, or you're out of the hand. Like the same way, like, who reminds me a lot of the strategy that Alex has? Garrett Adelstein, when he plays at Hustler Casino Live, right? When he's in a hand, everybody else goes quiet and they check to see what he's going to do. He's in full control. Either he's in full control or he's not in a hand, right? He's either the person.
So I actually do disagree with that. Okay. And maybe he's changed over time, but he's definitely historically VPIP'd a lot of hands where he did not have initiative pre-flop.
Right, which usually these are hands that he usually tends to lose. Of course, I mean it would make sense, but you're absolutely correct that he gets involved in a lot of hands. But I think that for the most part, he's grabbing the initiative. He 3-bets a lot, for instance, right? I mean, he 3-bets a lot with premium hands. What he does a lot, which I wouldn't necessarily agree with, and you're absolutely right. What he does a lot, he defends a lot in position with subpar hands. He likes to do that. So he's basically saying, I have the skill to play in position. I'm going to defend with my Jack 8 of hearts when he gets 3-bet from the blinds, and then he's like in the cutoff or something. So he does that a lot. I agree. And
well, no, I'm saying like he will flat 2-bets, not on the button. He'll flat 2-bets. He'll over limp.
I haven't seen him over limping in a long time. I could be wrong on this, but I haven't seen Garrett like limping in. Again, maybe like you said, maybe he's changed the strategy over the years. But
I mean, I can't imagine like him opening a small pocket pair facing like 4 limps. That just.
I've never seen him doing otherwise. Like he's always like
somebody watch Hustler and show.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess the time to be would be like multiple limps, and he has like 4s or trays. What's he going to do? Yeah, I'm not shifting to your side yet. I'm still hunkered down in that limping's going to outperform, because again, like you mentioned your strategy, right? Which is, that may very well be true, right? I would have to see the data,
right,
to be able to like say quantify it one way or the other, because otherwise it's just we're humans, we're biased,
right,
in so many different ways, and like we can probably remember the times where things went very well and don't really think about the times when they you invest like 8 or 9 bigs and then you just like check it down and you fold to a C-bet.
Absolutely.
Situation.
And one more thing that I remember now, like in my earlier days, like when I was playing lower stakes, like stakes, like let's say, especially like 5-5 in LA and things like that. And when the rake is like 6, or right now is even worse. Like now
that's a different,
$8. That comes into play too. And I should mention that it could affect, and this is something that I've thought about it too. It could affect, like you can't limp in situations where, like they take more than a big blind off the pot, right? I mean, you can't, like, you have to take that into consideration. So that could be
well, you
something.
can. I mean, there's always a thing, right? Yeah. It's like you say, never say can't, right?
No,
like,
I agree.
So like
I'm exaggerating here. I'm exaggerating clearly. Yeah.
Given specific table configurations, like I think that there are times like the player that's raising every time it's their big blind and you're very, very deep and somebody's just about to erupt like a volcano, then you can still limp and fade the high rake because the downstream opportunities are so good for you.
Sure.
In general, I would say like two things. In such a situation where the rake is that high, you shouldn't limp pocket trays on the button, but you shouldn't raise with them either. Like you should just fold them pre.
That is a possibility. And again, I want to clarify, when I say some of this, I'm Greek, we're used to to use these words as figure of speech. It's clearly figure of speech from the context here, but we can actually make a case for that. Possibly like folding could be the right thing, but it's just, it's when you are in control of the, and this is something that has taken me so much time to actually put into words because it's very, very difficult to articulate. But there is something about being in the zone at the poker table and running over the table and being in control. And like people thinking that every time you raise, you have aces. Why is that? Because again, you may be able to be selective with certain spots. And now the psychological aspect comes into it. So you can actually choose the proper textures and you can manipulate this. And a lot of this is, again, your uncapped range. I mean, it's not like, it's not strategical, but also a lot of it is the psychological aspect. So these two things combined, and the fact, hopefully, the person who's behind the wheel is somebody fairly competent, because if you don't identify the spots where you should shut down, I often say, for example, that it's a mistake. If you don't identify the spots where you should shut down, you may be even losing money with those pocket pairs, like you said, right? Because what ends up happening is you spend more money in your investment than you should have. For instance, if the flop comes like, let's say 8-7-6 and you have pocket deuces and you just c-bet anyway, because you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm aggressive. They think I have aces. I need to c-bet that. Then you're lighting money on fire. And then what started as a, 6x investment before the flop now turns into let's say you fire like, let's say 2/3 there, that turns into like a 35x investment overall. And that's a problem. Like that's essentially overplaying your hand. So it does take some, to be fair, it does take some proper calibration and manipulation of the pot and the circumstances in order to be profitable. But it may very well be, like you said, you know what, Duncan, you make money there, but if you limp, you will be making more.
Well, we just can't have it both ways, right? So we can't have it the way of if you raise and they flop top pair and we flop a set, we get their stack. But in a limp pot, when they bet the flop and we raise and they have top pair, we don't get their stack.
I think we can, because the size of the pot is different. That was my argument from the beginning, right? Because the size of the pot matters. Like people tend to, I agree that in general we cannot have it both ways, but the two situations are not identical. One is a small pot. People are like, you know what, you can have my X amount of dollars, doesn't matter. Whereas in the other situation, there's so much money already in the middle and people get greedy. They want to win all of that juicy chips in the pot. Again, I'm talking a little bit of a psychological factor, but it matters.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah. I guess we can.
But you're right. You're right, though, in the sense that if we think that the opponent will get the money in regardless, again, figure of speech, but we think the opponent will get the money in more often than not, regardless of the size of the pot. Like, let's say they're a recreational player, I would agree with you 100%. There's no point, actually. Like, initiative is absolutely useless. Like, especially somebody who plays for the first time, it really doesn't matter if they will call like every hand and
well, we've gotten a bit in the weeds here on this initiative initiative thing. So we got hunkered down in like strategy talk. And really the question we're trying to answer is like the mirage of initiative. Like, is it a thing? Is it not a thing? Is it valuable? Is it not valuable? What is it? I would say like, so on the surface, it's easy to understand what initiative is, but I think it needs to be broken down into different parts to be better understood exactly what's going on. Why is initiative typically relevant? Well, because strategy in theory is going to say that whenever you have a range advantage starting with pre-flop, then you get to bet more of those types of boards. And on boards where you don't have more equity, you typically don't get to bet, right? So it's not really initiative that's the guiding force. It's our range composition as compared to the board and our opponent's range composition compared to the board.
And honestly, I would agree with you. But like it's like saying, well, there's no such thing as a good company. Really, what matters is their earnings and the profitability. So I would say that profitability and earnings are a subset of what a good company is. Does that make sense? So you're basically saying, what is initiative? And now you're dissecting it into the range decomposition. So I would agree with you 100%. So if we want to call, instead of initiative, we want to call it range decomposition, I would. But
what does initiative lead to? Does it just let us bet every board no matter what? What does it matter if we have it and we can't use it?
Right. Let me see if I can find this. And just while I'm searching this, just to clarify something, I do firmly believe that there are situations where the initiative is like a mirage, like it doesn't really matter. But I would just say, like, I have this stupid picture that I also posted it in the book. Let me see if I can share my screen real quick. Like if we, I have this picture, right? I mean, this very stupid picture that probably is going to put a smile on a smirk on your face, like, Duncan, what the hell are you talking about, and where are you going with this? So I have this, like, when I first introduced poker to complete beginners, I'm trying to explain to them why the idea of betting is beneficial, and I've come to this simplification, hopefully not an oversimplification, that looks like this. Very broadly speaking, and this is not nuanced at all, but it gives a very big picture. We either have a good hand or we have a bad hand. And roughly speaking, the opponents either have a good hand or a bad hand. So I was trying to argue that if the opponent, let's say, has a good hand and we have a bad hand, we're pretty much going to lose, right? I mean, they have a good hand, we have a bad hand, nothing interesting is going to happen. If they have a bad hand, we have a good hand, again, nothing interesting is going to happen, we're going to win, right? Where really poker is being played is when we both of us have like good hand or decent hands. But more importantly, what poker is being played, I would argue, is when we both have bad hands. And that is the majority of the time because how difficult it is to actually make a hand in poker. And I would argue that the person with initiative, when we have a bad hand and they have a bad hand, the person with initiative is the one who's typically going to win. The way I call it is our nothing, it will beat their nothing.
Right. So what happens when you raise pre-flop and you have initiative and then you both have bad hands, right. Opponent checks, you bet, and they check raise.
Excellent. Then you see they're trying to use initiative too. I love that. I would say that this is a very good response to this. And I would say that if this opponent, has a bad hand and check raises, then we are up against a competent opponent. I would say that the answer to that would be, raise back at some point, or at least consider raising back. Like, you don't have to give up. And then we get into, I know. But my point, that's why I sometimes say, listen, if you're playing against an overly competent opponent, honestly, there's nothing you can do. Like, the best you can do is you can match them, right? You can just try to get the initiative back, float them, or, give up the pot or change tables. But for the most part, I would argue that this is the type of thing, like, that person realizes that initiative is important and they try to turn it against us.
It's not just that, it's like strategical things, right? It's like, if you always triple barrel, then I'm not
saying always, but yes. Yeah. But you take,
if you generally do, right?
I don't, okay. Yeah.
Then, like, basically there's going to be a corresponding strategic adjustment where the out of position player is going to not fold. Mm-hmm. In this situation where, like, they're not generally going to overfold. They're going to overcall because you're betting too frequently, and they're also going to find raises that they otherwise wouldn't find because you're betting too frequency. You're betting at such a high frequency that they get to adjust.
Correct.
Like basically, I'm just saying the game has a lot more depth than this.
And I agree. And we can get to counter adjust to that. I agree 100%. Like this is, I'm not belittling the game. What I'm saying is that I think that there's value in that initiative. And then what they're trying to do, notice, is that they're trying to, battle initiative with initiative of their own. The thing is, however, if we had initiative, before the flop, we get to have the uncapped range. So we can have the last laugh in this hypothetical example. What if we four bet? So we get check raise there, and then we come back and we say, you know what, four bet.
Yeah, then you could very well be placing bets when you're at a severe equity disadvantage post flop, because while you had the equity advantage pre flop, there's been information gain in the flop, and now we're placing 3 bets here, where sort of like the in position player is just placing 3 bets kind of almost in the dark, it feels. And the out of position player is check raising and has the option to place a 4th bet with a bunch of sets, especially if you're not structuring your strategy in such a way where you actually have like valid hands to bet 3 bet with, right? Like, so it all goes into like strategy and how many bets each specific part of your range wants to place on each specific board. And so like this, how
Can
I feel.
I say something? Sorry,
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Please finish your thought. I don't want to interrupt you.
I was just going to say, like, what I feel is like this is just kind of like a blind aggression battle without any downstream strategic implications taken into consideration when, we have 3 streets to play and we have a lot of different ways to place bets.
It certainly sounds that way. I'll give you that 100%. But here's why I don't think it is, because you mentioned before we cannot have it both ways, and I would say that we cannot have it both ways actually applies here, because what is it when we get raised on that dry board? Like, by the way, for the listener, because I know we're talking a lot. So the situation is we have.
Well, let's not even say that we raised the dry board, right? Let's say we just call the flop with a weak hand.
No, I really want to talk about the initiative because you mentioned something which I wanted to comment on, right?
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So the idea that, we have initiative, we bet on a dry board, let's say in position, out of position, it doesn't matter. We're in position. And then an opponent who snuffed that out, they actually raise us with nothing. So we bet with nothing on the board with initiative. They check raise us with also nothing. And now here's where I want to say we can't have it both ways. We need to make a decision. Do they have an equity advantage? I'm not talking about range advantage. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. Do we think we are behind the, our range? Do we think our range is behind the range when they do that? Or do we think they're over bluffing that spot? Because it's one or the other. If we do think they actually, because what happens a lot in those situations, and I've noticed that also in some of those televised games, what happens a lot is that people, they will do that from time to time. They will try to re-bluff you with their nothing, but they don't do it frequently enough. So you're more than happy to give them the pot because they don't do it enough. But is that the case? Case A, where people occasionally, they realize that you're trying to be full of it, so they will put a check raise from time to time? Or is it a person who will do that habitually, in which case they're over bluffing, in which case we can say, you know what, we can we can bluff their over bluffs, right? That's what I mean. Because we can't have it both ways. If they actually bluff at good frequencies, if they under bluff, we can actually safely fold and we're not being exploited. But if they actually over bluff that spot in order to take advantage of our bluffs, we can bluff their over bluffs, right? And I know it sounds like, I know, and it gets crazy, but this is why I'm saying it's in the hands of the person who can actually manipulate the spots well, because it sounds like it's oversimplistic, but it really has a lot into it. You're very well aware of what you're doing and very well aware of the possible adjustment. You don't just go there blindly.
And if you do have a very strong hand in position and villain is over bluffing,
right, the
counter adjustment is not to bet 3 bet a ton.
I agree.
It's to call and then call down, right?
Let me call it. Sorry. Okay. I wasn't, the counter adjustment is, I'm saying, let's call it folding versus not folding. I'm not saying that 4 betting is always the right option. And I agree with you 100%. Sometimes we can flat, sometimes we can, 4 bet. But my point is, we're not getting exploited just because somebody check raised us. We can still not fold.
Sure, of course.
Right.
Of course we cannot fold. Exactly.
But just to make sure that the point is clear, the point I was trying to make is that we cannot have it both ways. Like, we have to make a decision about the opponent. Are they over bluffing or not?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like, that's totally fair, but I don't see how, like, in this case, like, villains can continue through calling, right? Which means that they don't technically have initiative.
That's right. But then we get to see free cards. And then we get to see, like, that's great for us. Like, if the opponent calls us with nothing, remember, they have nothing, we have nothing. Oh, sorry.
I'm recording a podcast.
It's all real, folks. So it happens in real time.
Okay, where were we?
You were making a good point, and you were saying, well, what if they not check raise and instead they flat?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still failing to see, like, initiative being a reality, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not seeing that side of the argument yet.
I mean, wouldn't you? Let me put it this way: if and perhaps, again, you're thinking, you know, how would initiative affect somebody like you, right? I mean, who you're like a professional poker player who knows how to adjust. But would you?
I'm just talking about the game itself.
Itself.
You know?
Okay. So would we? Let me ask you this question: if, you know, we get our opponents to start calling us with nothing out of position, would we consider that a victory?
I don't know. It depends.
Okay, it depends. Yes, I mean, I would agree with you. It depends, actually. Again, who's on the wheel, right? I mean, it depends who's driving the car here. Because I would argue that if we make our opponents, you know, start making passive decisions out of position, we can put them in a world of hurt. Right. I mean, they still play our game of we are in control. Like, the way I like to the picture that I like to give. And I know this is a very silly picture. And some people will say, Duncan, who do you think you are? But it's like, you either go into the boxing match ready to punch everybody until somebody punches back. And then you say, you know, I'm out of here. Go fight by yourselves. You know,
the counter there is, like, there are lots of world champions that are amazing counter punchers. Right. And that's their whole strategy, is counter punching.
And I would agree that, you know, against people who are very good at counterpunching, you have to counterpunch, right? I mean, you just don't flinch. It's sort of like if somebody is a professional counterpuncher, you just don't flinch on the first counterpunch. So you put pressure back there. That's why I'm saying we cannot have it both ways. Are they over bluffing or not? Like, the counterpuncher, the habitual counterpuncher is the habitual bluffer in this metaphor.
I mean,
or rebluffer.
Well, they're just calling flop with equity and then just looking at downstream decisions, right? Like, basically, when you bet the flop, you have a lot of responsibility to manage your bet range, to manage your stop and go range, to manage your defense versus stop and go, and your check frequency on the turn. Like, there's a lot of strategic implications on these other streets that are more board type based and equity distribution based, and less initiative based, basically. Like, the theory of the game, right, is more what I'm getting into here, is that, like, there's a lot of complex theoretical situations and things that you need to manage, even when you bet the flop and you have initiative. For instance, you know, if the flop is like 4-6-9, the out of position player checks, the in position player bets like 70%, the out of position player calls, and the turns is 6. Well, the 6, typically, that middle card pairing is better for the out of position pre-flop caller than it is the in position pre-flop raiser. So the in position pre-flop raiser, like, now initiative, even though they were the last person to bet, they should not bet the turn at a high frequency, because the out of position player has more 6x in their range, right? So, which actually changes the way that the equity distribution is for the out of position pre-flop caller, and that specific player should be donking the turn or leading the turn more often than not, based on the theory of how that spot works, not based on any sort of, like, who bet last type of data point.
Absolutely. And I would agree with that 100%. Everything you said is absolutely correct. And the metaphor that I would give to what you just said, again, thinking about companies, it would be like saying, but look at the profitability of that company. They make $30 billion a year, whatever. No company makes 30 billion. They make $1 billion a year. Yeah, but their debt is like 10 billion. You know?
Right. Both of these things can be measured.
Right. Measured, exactly.
And quantified.
I agree. Like you basically shifting and you say, listen, initiative is not the important factor there. The texture is, and I would agree, like, the texture is incredibly significant. But I would also say that if the turn was not a 6 and was a card that, helps the initiator, right? Like it was a card like an ace or a king, which could be more in the person who raised in the range, as opposed to if they limped instead, then they can take advantage of that. So in that case, the initiative will be more of a factor. So the profitability will be more important than the debt if the debt is not that big. So that,
it could be, right? Unless
it could be.
You barrel every single turn, and then you start getting check raised, and all of a sudden you don't have enough hands that can place 3 more bets. So like there's all of these downstream strategic implications of board types, range versus range, and how much each piece of your range wants to invest at each specific node in the decision tree.
Correct.
And it's not influenced by who placed the last bet, in my opinion. It's influenced by what the ranges are and how each card or each information reveal affects each range. In the instance of like the uncapped player, the reason that they can barrel lots of turns is because not a lot of cards are going to shift the equities in the case of the middle card pairing. However, there are some cards, right? So to me, it's just less a function of like the player being the last person to bet, and more a function of they just have a lot more high equity hands than the other player. That's what's driving the action, not the ethereal concept of initiative where, I place the last bet, therefore I get the option of placing the next bet.
Sure. Let me try something, because I think definitions are failing us here, because I think we agree. I mean, if I understand what you're saying correctly. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, and I'm going to try to, to put it in my own words, and please correct me
if
I'm wrong. Yeah. So you're basically saying, okay, what you said earlier, Duncan, that initiative can be broken into 2 parts. There's the psychological and the strategical. What you mentioned as strategical is essentially range, right? It has to do with your range. You mentioned range advantage, you mentioned uncapped ranges. So it's all about range. So if you remove the word initiative and you talk about range,
it's more equity distribution, I guess, technically. Yeah.
I mean, equity depends on the range, right? I mean, you can't have equity distribution.
Equity distribution based on the range, yeah.
Based on the range, right? So okay. Again, we don't want to talk about range. We're going to talk about equity. I'm okay with that too, because again, these 2 things are related. But then the psychological aspect, I don't buy that at all, because again, it's not intrinsic to the game, and I don't care about it. Would that be fair?
No. Oh, I think the psychological aspect is real.
Okay.
I think that it's real, and it leans into our human biases, but it doesn't shift
But in this conversation, like, when we're talking about the game itself, like
talking about the game itself, no.
Okay.
No.
So we can put either way. We need to put the psychological aside, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. I'm fine with 2. Like, let's put the psychological aside, and now we're talking about the core elements of the game, and the core elements of the game.
What is tangible, and
it all comes down to equity, right?
Kind of. I'm
simplifying here just so we can have a conversation. You cannot be profitable in poker without nuance, right? I'm not trying to oversimplify it, just to communicate.
I know what you're saying. It's Philosophical Friday. So
no, please. What am I missing? What important part am I missing? Minus the nuance. And there's a lot of tremendous amount of nuance.
Yeah. I mean, there's multiple streets to place bets, and we need to be able to place bets across multiple lines and multiple outcomes and variables that we don't know about, which affects, our holistic strategy on the flop, where equity distribution is a factor. However, there's also these other factors of equity distribution across different lines: bet, stop and go, bet, check, bet, check, raise, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I call these buckets. All of these nodes, I call them buckets, and you have to distribute properly so that you can be fairly balanced, even if you're not following GTO. And I agree with you. But in the end of the day, like when we're talking about distribution, it all comes down to the equity, right? And what does, a specific, what does like a super frequent, like you mentioned before, if you bet all the time, that completely destroys your checking range. And as a matter of fact, it hurts your betting range too, right? You can't just like blindly go blast off because essentially you put your entire range into one bucket, the betting bucket, and then you become easily exploitable, right? But all of that comes down to, again, like equity analysis, right? And range analysis and decomposition, right? How do you want to decompose your range so that you're fairly balanced? You're not hurting your checking range too much. You're not hurting your check raising range too much, or you're not overly strong with your check raising range. That's another problem, and things like that. Correct.
Correct.
So yeah. I would agree with that. If we call the initiative, all of that, like the portion of.
I wouldn't call it any of that. I would say that's like an external thing that isn't related to the equity distribution and then all the strategic stuff.
Let me ask you this: if you put a raise in any situation, because maybe that's where our disagreement lies. Because I really need to find exactly where we disagree. Because what you're saying is actually absolutely correct, and I agree with that, and I employ that in my game too. So I'm very interested in that. So would you say in a vacuum, if we put a raise, all else being equal, somewhere on some street, there is a raise, not a call, just a raise, would you say that shifts the range upwards in some sense? That means that some of the worst hands
generally, the more bets placed before the river, the stronger the hands are.
Correct. Generally. For me, that's initiative. Like for me, that's what I call initiative. Like, and I tie that to the idea, sometimes I call poker is an honest game, just because a bet is more often than not value than bluff in a vacuum. So in general, like as a good, that's an aside, but I think it has to do with initiative. As an aside, a very good approximation for beginner players who've never played this game before would be to treat every bet honestly and every fold honestly, every check, medium strength, folding weak, and then betting as strong. If you do that in the long run, even though there's huge nuance, I'm not saying you're going to be making millions, but this is much closer to what winning poker is all about. Just because when people typically raise, they're stronger than when they don't.
I think where the disagreement from my side is that I feel as if you advocate that initiative is like initiative is almost the end all be all of poker strategy, right? Whereas
I do not. Yeah.
If I call a raise out of the big blind and I flop top pair and you go bet every time with your full range, right? So I'm going to have a massive equity advantage there. I'm never going to have initiative, but I'm always going to win 3 bets from you because you're always going to bet. And so like you did have the option of placing the bet and having initiative. However, it's not beneficial to you, basically.
Okay, that's good. That's good that you mentioned that because I was very careful. I exaggerate a lot, but I try to avoid when it comes to betting using words like always bet here or always do that, right? I mean, so I don't think I mentioned it. I may did it because again, I'm exaggerating, but I certainly, when I'm careful and when I want to put nuance into the conversation, I'm not an advocate of always doing anything poker wise, right? So I would never suggest, I said never right now, but I would never, I would never suggest though, like, go ahead and always, have the initiative. Like I said, initiative is just an aspect of it. However, to be fair, there are spots, like you mentioned, for example, calling out of, we were investigating, actually, you didn't mention it, we were investigating the idea of potentially calling out of position with equity. I would say that there are certain spots, and I see that players doing that all the time, and I highly disagree. The idea of, like, for example, check calling out of position with gut shots. I think that's typically a range suicide. When you are in situations like this, where you have equity, it's probably better to find excuses to push that equity, to raise instead of just passively calling out of position.
The downside to that is that it's much easier to have a gut shot than it is a set.
Correct.
And when you check raise every single time with every single one of your gut shots,
I never said every single time. Like we have to be very careful. So
we fold.
Yes, exactly.
Folding is the alternative option.
Folding is the alternative option. Correct. Exactly. Folding. That's why I'm very careful, and I'm saying it really matters who's behind the wheel, right? I'm not advocating blind aggression, but like folding and occasionally raising, like chasing like the 16% equity, in a situation where your opponent has the range advantage, has, like the texture, just because you want to be sticky becomes stationary very quickly. And I see that from high level opponents. And all I'm saying is, there are other ways to play the hand, and occasionally you can be aggressive with it, but folding is an option.
Yeah, and I mean, the size of the bet that you face is clearly going to be a big impact here. If you face a 30% flop c-bet size with a gut shot, you can't fold a gut shot, basically. Correct. If it's pot, then we have to think about it and generally fold.
But to our conversation, what a raise would do in that situation, like it will have a little bit of initiative in there. That raise in that spot will have a little bit of initiative, and we don't have to call it initiative, but I mean, we can call it fold equity. We can translate it into equity somehow.
Well, I mean, yeah, basically the translation to equity is you have high equity hands that want to check raise, and this is like a lower equity hand that you're using to check raise as it relates to range composition.
Perfect. Exactly. Right? Exactly. And Doug Polk does an excellent analysis when he's doing like his heads up. I mean, I'm very interested in heads up. And one of the things is, when you want to try to bluff, you got to start deciding which hands to bluff with. And I would say gut shots are some of the hands you need to add to your bluffing range. That is not to say, this is very important, and here I have to be nuanced. That is not to say you're bluffing every time you have a gut shot, but you can add some of your gut shot to your bluffing range, which means you can fold the rest, perhaps.
And the downstream implication too is that when you call the flop and you don't raise and the turn completes a gut shot, you don't have any gut shots in your range.
Okay.
Through virtue of folding them.
And
right?
Well, again, so here's the problem there. No, okay, no, I agree with you. But here's why I need to, like, we don't have to. There is a point where we are getting awfully close to GTO, right? I mean, there is a point where we're trying to have anything everywhere under any circumstances, and hypothetically, I would argue, that's why I'm saying that, hypothetically, that is the correct strategy. I would say it's probably easier and it will lead to fewer mistakes. Yes, if that happens, it's okay to occasionally not have that gut shot, because we may not need that gut shot. Like the problems we're gonna face, all the bad, like occasionally, yes, we're gonna hit our four outer on the turn. But I would say the downside of all the equity we're losing in all of the mistakes we're going to make by playing out of position and all the times we're going to get bluffed off the pot, it's just not worth it, I would say. So I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm saying,
I mean, there are also other, I mean, we're going a little bit over here.
No, please, I love it. We can talk about
the other downstream implication too is like if you're not calling with gut shots on the flop, when you do check call the flop and the turn checks through and then you bet the river, you're probably under bluffing, right? And I just want to caution about these sort of strategic oversimplifications that lead to downstream major exploitability here. Sure. Like it's not minor, it's a major exploitability by the river, because we just don't we just don't have bluffing ranges in spots where we need bluffing ranges, and we don't have calling ranges in spots where we need to have calling ranges. And then we find too many spots to raise where we don't have enough hands in our raising range.
And for the record, I agree with that 100%. And everything that I say here, like I said, grain of salt, it's not an oversimplification. There's one thing that I want to say, however, it is far more important to be worried about those things in position versus out of position. Like one of the things that I found over the years, and that's also a little bit anecdotal, is that trying to defend properly out of position can get you in a world of hurt. Like trying to have like calling ranges like out of position. Like but
just because it's hard and can get you in a world of hurt doesn't mean it's not worthy to investigate and figure it out and build a stronger strategy for those specific situations. I
agree 100%. I agree 100%. Yeah, there's no disagreement here.
Okay, so I think we probably didn't answer. Well, I wasn't converted to the side of initiative.
I wasn't trying to convert you, to be fair.
I know.
I'm not trying to convert anybody.
It was a topic where, there's disagreements. And as I said, like, disagreements tend to be opportunities to learn or grow or shift your paradigm in ways that are valuable. Right. And I mean, it's a good discussion and it's interesting. And yeah, I mean, I'm also the person who's going to say that, I don't really believe in momentum in sporting contests, which that can get me a lot of flaming and a lot of pushback there. But anyway,
I certainly don't believe in playing your rush.
I think psychological things, while real to humans, as it relates to the game aspect itself, is not real. The real thing is that people are psychologically affected by certain things. However, yeah, I think initiative is a function of all the things we said. I'm not gonna. We've beaten the dead horse, I think, at this point. If you, you want to tell the listener if they have any follow-up questions about this topic, where do they go?
Absolutely, yeah. So greatnessvillage.com. Like, if you people have any questions, there is an excellent thread there. You can also go on YouTube if you want to see some of the stuff we posted today, and have any comments, questions. Why Alex beats Bobby, and the Twitters, of course, of the world.
All the Twitters. Hit us up on the Twitters. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Absolutely. Take care, Brad.